Psychoanalysis course, Sigmund Freud, How Sweet It Will Be to Die. Namaste. Second episode of the series opens up as a conversation on Sigmund Freud. Guide in conversation is Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So, if we again get back to the beginning, how did Freud stumble into psychoanalysis?
One word answer would be destiny. He was destined to get into it and create it. Almost looks impossible that somebody can plan to create something like psychoanalysis. The emergence is almost, you can call it an accident or you can call it destiny, but seems to be more like destiny. If we have to account for it rationally, in a more secular way, we would put three reasons to why Freud went into where he went into, ending up creating psychoanalysis. One was the spirit of the age. That we had a situation where we had a basket full of psychological sicknesses and very few tools in the area of allopathy to really deal with them effectively. So the situation was crying for an alternative. This was one. Second was Freud was preceded by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And both of them had come very close to the idea of the unconscious in their own ways. And the idea of instinct beyond our awareness and control. Nietzsche would call it a drive to power, a drive to overpower, a drive to an endless power. And Schopenhauer would call it the will behind the phenomenal world. So he was already preceded by two giants, and the third was the whole tradition of hypnosis.
Okay.
Where you would put a person into hypnotic state and get into those memories which were not accessible to the person in the waking state. And indirectly, they were using the idea of the unconscious without calling it as such. So the idea of the unconscious was operational even before Freud came into the picture. If we go back in ancient Hindu psychology, the yogic psychology or the tantric psychology, the idea of unconscious is prevalent and very pervasive. In yogic psychology, it will go by the word of chitta or it will go by the word of sushuptaman. And in the tantric psychology, it will go by the word of the avachetan. So, in a way, one causal stream flowed from the history of Western philosophy and the history of ideas in the West. Second was the prevalence of sicknesses and the limitedness of then reigning allopathy to really do much about it, calling for an alternative approach. And the third stream was Freud's own analysis of himself. That Freud himself suffered from chronic neurosis. And he analyzed himself, and that went on for almost 7.5 years. In Indian context, we would almost call it a sadesati. So he went on and he called that period the period of splendid isolation. Just as Jung had a similar period, which he called the nakia. So all the three put together. And then the fourth was Freud found not only patients, but he found colleagues who had similar patients. So that converted a one-off experience into a phenomena on a scale. And Freud was convinced that what he was finding was not something one-off, was not an exception, but rather a rule which was difficult to find that he was finding out. So being at Vienna helped, the richness of Vienna helped, and then the Second World War allowed him to revise his thesis and bring in the, if we were to use the Hindu phrases, the Rudra element into psychoanalysis, the death instinct.
Death instinct.
So those four things got together and enabled Freud, along with his work, let me say the five elements, his work with Charcot and Brewer, which allowed him first-hand experience of the unconscious, which really provided him the sure foundation that he was on the right track. So these five got together to enable Freud to create psychoanalysis the way he created. And as Meltzer would say, if it is not autobiographical enough, it is not psychoanalytic enough. So Freud analyzed his own dreams, Freud analyzed himself, Freud analyzed as much of his unconscious as it would leak out to him. And all of that put together led to the fundamental principles of psychoanalysis.
So that is to do with the Freud journey towards psychoanalysis. If we see how were the initial days of psychoanalysis, how it works.
Initial days of psychoanalysis were very eventful and very turbulent because it was a fragile science attacked by everybody. And Freud used to say to Jung, when Jung would bring out ideas other than what Freud had, which Freud had discovered after repeated analysis of patients, he would tell Jung two things. One, don't go so far when you are so near.
Okay.
That stick to the fundamentals of psychoanalysis that I have found after years of hard work and repeated verification. Don't go into mystical ideas which are as yet unproven. And that was because he was trying to build a science and save that science from attacks. And anything loose without evidence would be attacked by the enemies of psychoanalysis and destroy the science completely. And there were two problems with this science. One, this science was bringing up something that nobody wanted to accept and see. It was bringing up the unconscious material of everybody. So it was bringing up something which nobody wanted to accept or see, leave alone analyze or even develop and elaborate upon it. This was the first part. The second part was the atmosphere at that point was blatantly anti-Jewish. We can't imagine the kind of times in which Freud lived. The atmosphere was extremely anti-Jewish and there was a deep hatred in the Christian mind related to Jews. So much so that entire psychoanalysis was called a Jewish perversion because most of the initial masters in psychoanalysis were Jews. Non-Jews would say, these are the perversions of the Jews. This does not operate in our minds. It was almost like somebody saying to Darwin, okay, when Darwin proposed that our ancestors were monkeys, somebody can say, maybe your ancestors were monkeys, not our ancestors. It was similar to an argument that there were voices on the far Christian right to term psychoanalysis as a Jewish perversion. And that was one of the reasons why Freud wanted Jung to lead this movement, because he was the only Protestant Christian among the leading lights of psychoanalysis. Everybody else was a Jew. Freud was a Jew. Adler was a Jew. Wilhelm Reich was a Jew. Ferenczi was a Jew. So because the Otto Rank was a Jew, so because the original founders were mostly Jews and there was an attack on psychoanalysis, Freud wanted to save it. So there was a kind of a siege mentality that you are inside a fortress attacked from all the sides, and there the core function then is survival. It is not the space for diversity of opinion or individual freedom. What happens to any community under siege? And that made Freud even more autocratic than he naturally was. Because he felt that if you allow too much of diversity and too much of openness to ideas,
Openness.
just sticking to the core ideas which are well founded, anything less than well founded would be taken as a sample of the looseness of psychoanalysis.
Looseness.
So those days were very eventful, spent in a siege mentality, attacked by everybody. And Freud had to navigate through those difficult times to save psychoanalysis. It's almost like a Noah's Ark that Freud was navigating to save the ship in turbulent oceans. And he was under attack from all sides. And he would always say that even 100 years from now, psychoanalysis still will be under the attack from people the same way it is today, and that we find true even today. That despite the liberal, the attack has not.
Because he talks about the unconscious, which remains unconscious forever by biological aspects of human mind. So every time it is subjected outwardly, there would be a lot of unconscious resistance to accept the theory.
So what he said, there would be a savage, wild, inchoate rage.
Yes.
And that we see even today, how psychoanalysis stirs up deep-seated rage, which is almost inchoate, almost inane.
With specific personalities too. If we see the PDs, in some discussion, we can touch that as well. Certain PDs have very high resistance with psychoanalytic theories.
Correct.
I've seen a lot of students having that. And then they're dropping off psychoanalysis, going to other branches of CBT, which are all nurturing and that doesn't stir anything inside of you.
Correct. And many people have gone out of psychoanalysis because it was too much to handle.
Too much.
I would cite Aaron Beck, the founder of CBT, as one of the good examples. I mean, what was stirring up inside of him was too much. Not that he did not create something valuable. CBT is very valuable.
Yes, indeed.
But his exit from psychoanalysis had largely to do with what was stirring up inside of him, being in psychoanalysis. So that is true even today. Go to any psychology class and you will even today find, even at master's level, you will find not only students but even faculty members who have unexplainable rage and hatred to psychoanalysis.
And resistance to go in depth for the discussions also.
Correct. So that hatred and anger is towards what is in their own unconscious, which is projected onto psychoanalysis because it stirs that up. So the initial days were very eventful, and the initial days also were related to multiple, how would I say, anointations, crowning of Prince Charmings, and eventual exit of Prince Charmings. There were many separations with Freud. Freud had this cyclical thing in relationships. He would intensely get infatuated with the person and the person would reciprocate, and then eventually he would have a fallout and they would say. So the same thing repeats with Adler, with Ferenczi, with Otto Rank, with Carl Jung. So the initial days also were the days of separation from Freud of many masters who were, along with Freud, the founders of in the initial days of psychoanalysis.
So there is a possibility that the psychoanalysis, what it experienced in a more psychological domain, early life object loss, multiple times, had it to do with Freud himself?
Yeah. Freud did not have the emotional capability to really sustain a long-term relationship. And partly it had to do with his own fear of closeness. And partly it had to do of displacement of anger and hatred from early childhood, mostly the parents, onto people. And partly it had to do with his narcissistic rage, which would come up when somebody would deviate from what he said. And part of it had to deal with the atmosphere because he was navigating a fragile boat in turbulent oceans. And partly it had to do with his philosophical foundations. His philosophical foundations were of materialism and pessimism. So in ontological terms, he was a materialist, and in teleological terms, he was more of a pessimist. And that created many difficulties. The philosophical aspect of Freud created many difficulties, not only for psychoanalysis, but for Freud himself. And we'll get into it slightly later, the philosophical aspect of Freud. But all this put together ultimately led to differences in theory which could not be tolerated, and eventually led to separation. And everyone who separated from Freud, for some reason we don't know why, underwent a psychological crisis. Yeah, very deep psychological crisis. Jung went through his own very deep psychological crisis. Ferenczi went through his own deep psychological crisis. Same with Adler. So there was something
on separating from Freud.
Yeah. So there was something very intense about relating to Freud, and something which was traumatic in separating from Freud. And as providence would have it, or luck would have it, Freud deeply felt all those separations, but he never went into the crisis that others went into. Freud was able to manage the separations far better than others. And it's a good question to go into why it was so.
So why?
One of the reasons was, it's a difficult question, but let me just put it in short. One of the reasons was, most people who came to Freud as disciples, they entered into a son-father relationship. And most of them had trouble in their childhood. And Freud, apart from being the leader of the theoretical component of psychoanalysis, for many of them also was a kind of an analyst.
Yes.
So Freud was also a kind of analyst. So the projections of early life parent figures were on Freud, which Freud did not have so much on them. It's very interesting to note that when Jung came to Freud, Freud would call him my Prince Charming. And it was as much a teacher-disciple relationship as a father-son relationship, where Freud wanted Jung to succeed him as a son succeeds the father in leading the psychoanalytic congress. And therefore, whenever Jung would deviate, Freud used to say, don't go so far when you are so near. And finally, Jung wrote to him saying, it is dangerous for the chicken to be cleverer than the hen, but what is in the egg must find courage to creep out. So these were some of the reasons. And also, leaving Freud at that time was professionally very difficult, because many of them would get patients because of Freud's reputation, Freud's references. And they were able to advance in this area also largely because of Freud's continuing discoveries. So it was professionally very difficult, personally very difficult, and psychoanalytically, in the sense of the unconscious, also very difficult to really break from Freud. It was like starting from a scratch all over again, professionally, personally, deep at the level of the unconscious. All of it put together. And just to make a point that none of those who actually came to Freud were psychologically healthy. And expectedly so, because you don't expect a leading light of psychoanalysis to be psychologically healthy. You can't be psychologically healthy and a master in psychoanalysis. I mean, they are mutually exclusive.
Exclusive.
So all this put together probably created that phenomenon.
Quite interesting. Coming back to early Freud and late Freud, how did he evolve his theory?
Early Freud was simple. There was a drive for survival and there was a drive for pleasure. The drive for survival would give rise to aggression, and the drive for pleasure would give rise to libido. And so the two were fundamental forces which were working in human nature in different phenomena. So all phenomena ultimately were phenomena related to survival or pleasure. And there was naturally, therefore, a tendency to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And pain being unbearable, threat to survival being unbearable, would give rise to certain complexes, which in turn would give rise to pathology.
Hmm.
So these were the initial Freud was very simple in that sense. The complication came in the initial Freud with component instincts. That how the component instincts slowly develop, and it was put forward by Freud, but never very clearly elaborated. But the late Freud was slightly mystical with the advent of the death instinct. Because many people even today believe that there is no need to conceptualize death instinct. You could just do with aggression. You could say that aggression is what leads to self-destruction or destruction of the other. You don't have to conceptualize death instinct, because one of the differences between aggression and death instinct was the two ideas. The idea of going back to the state of inertia.
Actually.
And the second was the idea of masochism. These two were incompatible with the traditional thinking, and even today they are incompatible. Many people believe there is no need for conceptualizing the movement, the pull to inertia and the pull to masochism. Destruction can be explained by aggression, and masochism can be explained as inversion of sadism. That you want to be a sadist, but you cannot be. So by identification, you live out your sadism by being masochistic.
But I think what he says makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Death instinct.
Yeah. So that was carried on forward by Melanie Klein also. And I think it's a good concept to further develop. Some like Andre Green have
Your
developed.
voice is gone.
Hello?
Now you're audible.
Okay. So I was saying the death instinct concept is a very good concept. But it has to be reformulated. Some people like Andre Green have worked upon it. I also have theorized about it. I title it Death of the Death Instinct. And we reformulate
Death of the Death Instinct.
Death of the Death Instinct, and we reformulate it. That how it can be deconstructed into its components. So the late Freud was into death instinct, especially after the Second World War. Mourning and melancholia from thereupon. That first you have mourning and melancholia, and then you have beyond the pleasure instinct. Beyond the pleasure instinct, where he slowly gets into the idea of the death instinct and the pull inside to go back to the state of matter, the state of complete inertia. And he roots the pull to go back to complete inertia, repetition, and masochism, and destruction, self-destruction and other destruction in death instinct. So then it becomes life instinct and death instinct. So instead of having aggression and pleasure, now you have life instinct and death instinct. And the life instinct sort of mellows down or attenuates the death instinct. And it's a play of the two. That in the early part of life, the life instinct is much higher than the death instinct. And as you age, the intensity of life instinct reduces and the intensity of death instinct increases. And therefore, the whole degeneration of body also we see. And the idea was philosophically rooted that in nature, we see life and death both. So if life is because of a will to live, death should be because of a will to die. And if we replace the word will by a force, then there must be two forces. How can there be a phenomenon
Absolutely.
without a force behind it? So if life comes into existence because of a life force, death must be coming into existence because of a death force. And the death force, one can call it entropy in physics, a natural degeneration, or one can call it disorder, or we can call it a pull to go back to the state of inertia, destroy oneself, enjoy in one's suffering, or do destruction and suffering unto others. And this almost becomes in a more nuanced way, almost like good and evil. So it's almost like creating a holy science of duality in a more sophisticated psychological scientific terms. So Freud evolved his thinking, and what did not happen with Freud was after he would discover something new, he would not reinterpret his earlier work in terms of the new. So after he developed the structural model, he did not reinterpret the cases which he had solved using the topographical model. After his advent of life and death state model, he never reinterpreted the cases he had solved or explained using the structural model. So this was the early and late Freud, and it's very interesting. All great thinkers, not all, let me say most great thinkers have an early and a late phase to them.
Most.
Yeah. So we can see it in Lacan, we can see it in Bjork, we can see it in Heidegger, that the early and the late are very different. And this is true equally of Freud.
So it must have been like one of a controversy on Freud related to idea of death instinct. Can we visit that dark place?
Yes, it was very controversial. Even today it is controversial. Many people believe it should not be there and one can do with aggression. But I am one of those on the side of Freud and Klein that this concept
Death
is
instinct.
valuable. What can be done is to deconstruct the death instinct and deconstruct the death instinct into its components and reformulate and develop it. One component of death instinct is the call of the inertia. The second is the habit of matter to repeat itself. What gives stability to matter? That matter is stable because the components are repeating themselves in the same way. So you don't find silver becoming copper tomorrow, copper becoming steel tomorrow. So whatever are the material properties, they are reasonably stable because the constituents are stable, and they are stable because they are repeating certain movements. What at the macro level makes that substance be what it is. So there is a call of inertia, there is a repetition, there is masochism, and there is also guilt, a self-destructive guilt.
Guilt of?
Guilt of superego created guilt, but guilt which is not justifiable, an unjustifiable guilt, which is created.
Some byproduct of life force.
Yeah, no, the unjustified guilt that can be an outcome of the death instinct, and a destructive envy. All of this will have to be separated in terms of its components, and then we'll be able to see the death instinct in its more clear form. The dark space will get illumined. More I have said when I have tried to reformulate the death instinct, but for here, I think this should suffice, and we can discuss more when we take Freud's paper of Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Waiting for that episode. Right. So a few minutes ago, you mentioned about the philosophical angle to do with the Freudian ideas. Philosophically, how is Freud placed in the history of ideas itself?
He has a very strange position. He is a materialist and a pessimist, which is very strange because Marx was a materialist but an optimist. Schopenhauer was a pessimist but not a materialist. And materialism dreads certain ideas. Materialism dreads the idea of design because design can lead to the idea of intention. And then the question is, how can material have an intention? And if material does not have an intention and there is design, then there is absurdity. And then you dread existentialism, that human being who is a product of an absurdity, some of them go out in search of meaning. Now, how absurd this is that a product of absurdity goes out in search of meaning.
Meaning.
So these are the
Why not?
so these are the prospects materialism dreads. So Freud was a pessimist, and he wrote to Einstein also that he does not see optimistically a great future for the human race because the forces of aggression, sadism, domination are far more powerful than the forces of love, compassion, and concern. So Freud was a pessimist like Schopenhauer, but unlike Schopenhauer, he was not against eros. In Civilization and its Discontents, he writes about a limited leeway being given to eros and not to repress it too heavily. Unlike Schopenhauer, who was like Buddha completely against the whole idea of eros because it was entangling and the entanglement was leading to pain. Schopenhauer would say about life, endless pain to a painful end. So compared to him, Freud was more optimistic. He was not as pessimistic as Schopenhauer. So he was there. Now, important point was his materialism would not allow him to take the next step of life energy, because that would have brought him straight into the Indian ideas of chakras and nadis and prana. So he hesitates to call libido the life energy. And one of the points of breaking up with Jung was this. There are many points. One of the points was this. Jung was ready with the idea of life energy and ready with the idea of design in the human mind through collective unconscious and archetypes. A structured mind, not a tabul rasa. But Freud believed strangely in a tabul rasa. At the same time, tabul rasa was endowed with life and death instincts. And it was also endowed with a program to create the unconscious, the pre-conscious, and the conscious. So it was a strange kind of philosophical quagmire that Freud actually could not negotiate out of. So philosophically, Freud is a very interesting position. He was in the middle of complexities, trying to find a materialist way out, not finding a way out of his materialism, given what is in front of him. And he was not ready to take the step of going into wider Hindu psychology and Eastern psychology. And that's where most of psychoanalysis is stuck today, along with Freud. That the next step cannot be taken, the dead end cannot be overcome. The brick wall in front cannot be surmounted unless you take the next steps into the Eastern psychology. So Freud that way is very controversial, but very interestingly placed philosophically.
It is said Freud is a Weltanschauung, and that is how we pronounce the name?
Yeah. What it means is it's a complete worldview, a complete paradigm.
Okay.
Freud is not only in psychoanalysis, but he is used practically in entire social sciences and humanities. You take film studies and you will have a Freudian film analysis. You go to mythology, anthropology, sociology, economics, and everywhere, management, everywhere you can have Freud.
Even literature.
Even literature, very much so. So Freud, somebody said, is actually an atmosphere of opinion. And he is a Weltanschauung, a complete world, a complete paradigm, almost like a darshan as we would call in the East. That you can take a vantage point in Freud and from there analyze practically everything in the areas of social sciences and humanities. And like Nietzsche, we don't realize that Freud and Nietzsche have been so internalized that even those who refute them, those who dislike them,
Incorporate.
actually stand on the foundation that they have created. It's like there is a high-rise building, the foundation is Freudian, and on the 10th floor, you are discussing how wrong Freud was.
Mm.
That is the state of affairs.
Every few decades, there is a back to Freud movement, almost a pilgrimage. What does it say?
It says that some of the ideas are eternal and there is no escape from it. And therefore, they return to Freud every 2 decades. And let me just go on with something I remember from the last question of Nietzsche. Freud philosophically was heavily influenced by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And Nietzsche he would dread because he found as though he had almost said most of the things Freud wanted to say.
Okay.
So this
But
is
Nietzsche existed little prior to Freud or same time? They coexisted or there was some, I think 20 years prior to Freud,
there would be
the
some
work?
overlap. There would be some overlap.
Some overlap.
There would be some overlap. But let me just check up. I'm not so good in the chronology of it. Maybe Nietzsche was
Okay.
before. It most probably would be before, but let me check out. Because Freud was reading books as though he was before, so there must have been before. But I'm not very good in chronology. But the influence definitely was there. That Nietzsche's best work had preceded Freud. And